Final Fantasy VII Remake doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Take this scene, for example. Why is Cait Sith having a melty here? The answer might seem obvious, he's reacting to the dropping of the plate. But that's not really what I'm asking. I'm asking why Cait Sith, the cat puppet that's controlled by Reeve, is having a performative meltdown over the dropping of the plate. If he was already with the party, it might make sense. He needs to maintain his cover. But he's entirely alone in this scene, which means that Reeve is controlling the puppet to make it have a performative meltdown for literally no one. It's a scene that makes perfect sense until you stop to think about it for a moment. And then, when you do stop to think about it for a moment, that's when you realize that it doesn't really make much of any sense. And I hear you, is this scene really that big of a deal? No, but it felt like an easy way to introduce the problems with the writing in Remake overall. A lot of what happens in Remake only makes any sense until you take a moment to stop and think about it, and then when you do, like peeling away the layers of an onion, you just find more and more problems with the world and the story of Remake. Also, as a quick aside, I do understand that many of the original staff, including the original writer, are working on the Remake trilogy. That actually makes things worse though, as at best it seems like they no longer understand the original, and at worst it seems like some of them are actively embarrassed by it. The writing in Remake has so many issues that I would assume heavy use of AI had it been released more recently, and there's likely no better place that serves as an example of this than the Reactor 5 section of the game. But before getting into the meat of the issues with this section, I want to ask two questions that should be relatively simple to answer. The first is, how did Shinra know what reactor Avalanche would choose as their second target months, if not years, in advance? The second is, why was Jesse's bomb suddenly strong enough to blow up a reactor? These weren't ever questions that needed to be asked of the original, but they need to be asked of the remake. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, let me explain. Remake changes major portions of the Reactor 5 section, starting mostly the same Cloud and Avalanche board the train to Sector 4. For seemingly no reason at all, Shinra is able to detect that they are on the train. Why this happens is never directly explained, but scenes with Heidegger, and also those with Cloud and Avalanche themselves, imply that Shinra is able to monitor Avalanche seemingly whenever they would like, and the game more or less tells us that all or most of what is happening in the scene is part of President Shinra's grand plan. Like in the original, Cloud and Avalanche escape into the train tunnels, but very much unlike in the original, we see that Heidegger is cooking up a scheme that involves throwing countless robots and soldiers at Avalanche to collect data to train the Airbuster. It's after Avalanche gets through the tunnels and places the bomb in the reactor that the curtain is pulled back, and they're hit with the shocking revelation that they got played. When they eventually reach the Reactor 5 exit, they find out that a good portion of what they've done up until that point was part of a carefully laid plan by President Shinra. The grand finale, as Heidegger calls it, of President Shinra's plan to foment anti-Wutai sentiment is to have Shinra's prototype weapon, the Airbuster, execute Avalanche live on TV. And none of this, as Remake feels a need to constantly remind players, is spur of the moment like it was in the original. It's all a part of President Shinra's plan. That's why, for example, you have Heidegger's soldiers talking to him about things like previously projected casualty rates.
Fall within the admissible range. However, the casualty rate significantly exceeds previous projections.
And all of this leads to one massive issue, the Airbuster itself. The Airbuster in Remake, much like in the original, is a prototype. It isn't something that Shinra is mass producing. But when our protagonists get to Reactor 5, the Airbuster is already there. Not only is it already there, but so too are the facilities and infrastructure to get it up and running, including a multi-floor complex connected by tunnels that allow for the delivery of parts to the Airbuster. And we know that this isn't something common to the reactors, as there really wasn't anything like this in Reactor 1. We see on the way into Reactor 1 that the upper-level facilities are different, and Cloud even comments, different reactor, different layout, it depends on when it was built. In the Reactor 5 portion, Barrett asks, layout's the same as Reactor 1, and Cloud replies, yeah, we're near Mako storage. Ignoring for a moment that there is one very noticeable difference between this same area in Reactor 1, Cloud's reply indicates that the area is only the same because of its proximity to Mako storage. In short, Reactor 5 is likely the only reactor equipped for the Airbuster in Remake. Which brings us back to the first question. How did Shinra know what reactor Avalanche would choose as their second target months, if not years, in advance? If you're still not picking up what I'm putting down, let me phrase the question slightly differently. How did Shinra know months, if not years in advance, which reactor to install all of the infrastructure necessary for the Airbuster prototype into? That's the only way they'd be able to effectively utilize it as the grand finale of President Shinra's plan. Even if you wanted to argue that multiple reactors had this infrastructure already, and Shinra simply moved the airbuster into Reactor 5 ahead of time, or that Shinra moved all of the infrastructure necessary for the airbuster into Reactor 5 in the day or so between the Reactor 1 and Reactor 5 attacks, that still creates one massive problem. How did Shinra know, before Avalanche had even boarded the train, what their second target was going to be? This was never an issue in the original, because in the original, where the airbuster came from was never explained. And it was never explained because where it came from wasn't important. The airbuster itself wasn't even important. It was a throwaway boss meant to demonstrate both the hubris and the greed of Shinra. The original was very good at leaving things that didn't need to be explained unexplained, because the people working on it understood that trying to fill in every single gap creates more problems than it solves. And if you wanted to argue that, well, like the original, all of this was a spur-of-the-moment trap set by Shinra once they knew what Avalanche's second target was, well, nearly everything in the story of Remake contradicts that. But surprisingly, there's an even bigger problem in the Reactor 5 section of Remake, and it comes immediately before the airbuster fight begins. Heidegger shows Avalanche a video of his little robots rewiring the bomb that Jesse made. He changes it so that it's no longer on the switch that Avalanche is carrying, but so that it is now on a timer. But he, and the writers of the game, are forgetting something critical about the narrative in Remake, something they all should know. The writers of the game are forgetting a critical piece of Remake's narrative in this scene. I said that a second time because I wanted to drive that point home. This is what I meant when I said that it feels like AI was heavily employed in Remake's writing, as it frequently seems like it lacks any object permanence. The writers forgot a critical plot point, not from the original Final Fantasy VII that was made nearly 30 years ago, but from Remake, the game that they were making right then and there. We know that Jesse's bombs aren't powerful enough to blow the reactors. We see this during the Reactor 1 mission when, even when using a blasting agent that is more powerful than the one she was supposed to use, her bomb still does less damage to the reactor than the fight with the Scorpion tank did. This all leads to one of the longer, more involved new side quests in the game too. And Heidegger also knows that her bombs aren't enough to blow the reactors, or he should, but he's suddenly forgetting, and so are the writers. And it seems like so too were a lot of the players. Even if you wanted to argue that he blew Reactor 5 in the same way that he blew Reactor 1, well, if that were the case, there would then be no reason for him to go through all of the trouble of rewiring Jesse's second bomb to explode on a timer. Additionally, the game directly contradicts this. It does this in a scene that most people will never see, but if you run out of time in the airbuster fight, Remake very clearly shows the bomb taking out Reactor 5. This isn't even something that could be chalked up to ludonarrative dissonance or anything like that, because everything in this scene, including the countdown timer during the actual fight with the airbuster, points to the bomb itself that Heidegger went out of his way to set a timer on being the thing that blows up the reactor. So, back to the second question, why was Jesse's bomb suddenly strong enough to blow up a reactor? Even if you wanted to argue that Heidegger's robots didn't just modify the bomb to be on a timer but to be more powerful or something, ignoring for a moment that that's not really how bombs work, there is nothing in the scene to indicate that. And there's no way Jesse wouldn't make the bomb right the second time, especially after getting the proper blasting agent in said side quest. If anything, she would likely have made the second bomb less powerful than the first, which already wasn't very powerful.
You saw the way the reactor went up. It was huge, right?
Because of all the Mako. Isn't that what you said?
Yeah. That was wishful thinking. Deep down, I know it was my fault. I used a more powerful blasting agent than the directions called for. It had nothing to do with the Mako.
Let's say you're right. So what?
I'm planning on using a weaker blasting agent this time. But, since I can't get in touch with my supplier, our only option is to loot a warehouse owned by Shinra.
Shinra? Good luck with that.
Once again, this wasn't an issue in the original because nothing changed about Jesse's bombs from the first attack to the second. She wasn't horrified about what she thought was her fault in the original. She initially expresses surprise at the extent of the damage, but then goes on to say that she's proud of her bomb's debut. And on the subject of bombs, there's a third question that needs to be answered. How did Heidegger know that Jesse's original bomb wasn't going to be strong enough to blow up Reactor 1? Think back to the Reactor 1 scene. As Jesse's bomb explodes, President Shinra and Heidegger are watching it happen in real time. President Shinra nods to Heidegger. Heidegger pulls out his smartphone and taps what is effectively a self-destruct button that makes all of the robots in the reactor go crazy and cause the reactor to explode. We know that this isn't after the fact via recorded footage or something, and that it all happens in the span of a few seconds, because Avalanche is still in the elevator when all of this occurs. If you don't think about it at all, Heidegger having a self-destruct button for the reactor makes perfect sense. But when you take a moment to think about it, this button causes a number of problems from a story perspective, and then you have to ask yourself, why does Heidegger have a self-destruct button ready to go the moment that Jesse's bomb blows up? Even if you wanted to argue that Heidegger and President Shinra had the collective authority to have someone make something like this, it isn't something that they would just cook up randomly and keep in their back pocket for no reason. Like, what if Heidegger accidentally butt-dialed the reactor explosion at some point? So, the explanation that makes the most sense is Heidegger and President Shinra somehow knowing ahead of time that Jesse's bomb wasn't going to do enough damage. But if that is the case, how on earth did they know that? For argument's sake, there are a couple of other possible explanations, but they both make far less sense. One possible, yet less plausible explanation is that the reactor was wired to blow before Avalanche ever got there. But then the issue becomes, how did Shinra know that Avalanche would attack this specific reactor? How did they know that anyone would not only try to blow up a reactor, but this one specifically? Another possible, even less plausible explanation is that every reactor was wired to blow at the push of a button for some reason. Maybe Shinra was already working on their anti-Wutai campaign when, thank their lucky stars, Avalanche just happened to attack. But that's absurd because A, why on earth would Shinra make it so that every single reactor could be blown up at the push of a button, and B, we see that that isn't the case with Reactor 5. On top of that, when they first see Avalanche break in, they're not even entirely sure who they are, and they don't even know that Avalanche has a bomb until almost right before they set it. So, even if you wanted to argue that Heidegger had Shinra programmers whip up a one-touch make reactor go boom button in the 20 to 30 minutes between when the bomb timer was set and when it went off, why would he even think to have that as a ready-to-go one-button contingency unless he already knew something? Any cohesiveness that the world has starts to fall apart because, like with the issues in the Reactor 5 section, this button causes a number of narrative and world-building issues that are never addressed or resolved in any way. And these are just some of the more glaring issues brought about by Square Enix messing around with a narrative that they no longer seem to understand. There are plenty more, large and small, that we could dive into, but I don't want this video to be as long and as bloated as Remake itself, so I'll instead focus on the final, and likely most important, question that needs to be answered. Which is, why did Shinra need to do any of this? I've played Remake twice at this point, so I understand the excuse that the game gives us. It tells us that this was also Shinra could foment anti-Wutai sentiment, but this doesn't make any sense in the world constructed by Remake, because the game is also constantly reminding us that this was something that they could have easily accomplished at any time without ever relying on Avalanche and without costing themselves billions of gil by blowing up their own reactors. And even if they had, for some reason that Remake never explains, been so wildly desperate that they needed to use Avalanche attacking them as an excuse, after the Reactor 1 attack they already have a video of them planting and detonating a bomb in one of their reactors. The small amount of damage done by said bomb is irrelevant at that point, and this isn't even speculation on my part because when Cloud returns from the Reactor 1 bombing, he tells Tifa not to believe what she sees on the news because the news is just another Shinra mouthpiece. They'll spread whatever lies Shinra tells them to. I'm not entirely sure why the game felt the need to poke holes in its own narrative at this point, but what Cloud is effectively telling us here is that Shinra could easily spin the Reactor 1 attack, as is with nothing more than Jesse's bomb, any way they wanted to. There was no need for them to actually big bada boom the entire reactor. And this isn't just hyperbole on Cloud's part either. The game shows us at multiple points that Shinra effectively controls the news. And even if they didn't have that video, even if our Avalanche cell never laid a finger on their reactors, they still wouldn't need to blow anything up to false flag Avalanche and Wutai attacks, because Remake also tells us that the other Avalanche cell is already working with Wutai to attack Shinra bases. And given the information network in 1984 style constant monitoring that Remake shows Shinra to have and to engage in, it's hard to believe that Shinra wouldn't know anything about that.
Beats me. We've been on the outs ever since our cell got labeled too extreme, though they're the ones running around with mil-spec gear. Word is, they cut a deal with Wutai. Promised them all the materia in Midgar, apparently.
And the game then goes on to further bang the drum that Shinra never needed to rely on Avalanche for any of this with the dropping of the plate. If they were really dead set on costing themselves billions of gil by blowing up their own reactors, they could have just sent the Turks in disguise to place a bomb. The dropping of the plate was never a problem with the original game because the point of said plate drop was to wipe out Avalanche and anyone who might be working with them to stop them from blowing up even more reactors. Blaming that on Avalanche was a way for Shinra to kill two birds with one stone. But Shinra having the Turks in their employ, a unit that is willing to do anything up to and including potentially killing hundreds of thousands if not millions of people for a false flag attack, means that Shinra never had any need to rely on Avalanche like they do in Remake if they wanted to commit false flag attacks. These are the sort of problems that arise when you make fundamental changes to load-bearing aspects of a narrative without accounting for the knock-on effect those changes will have. The Midgar portion of the original only worked because it was a story about a group of desperate amateur terrorists bombing reactors to strike at the Goliath that was Shinra, and Shinra reacting to those bombings. When you change that to have the attacks be the machinations of the Goliath itself, the greedy corporation that is Shinra, very likely because you think players wouldn't be able to handle running around as murderous terrorists in 2022, you need to account for that in ways that go beyond magic buttons and bombs. When you try to just shoehorn in plot elements from the original with new narrative underpinnings, like they did in Remake, you end up with inconsistencies and plot holes galore. I think, though, that the ultimate irony is that the answer to all of the story issues in Remake was staring Square Enix in the face all along. Effective utilization of the Whispers, as dumb of a story element as they were, would have allowed Square Enix to have their cake and eat it too. They could have kept the hands of the player characters relatively clean and had a story that made some semblance of sense. But in researching for this video, I found a bunch of articles that shed a fair bit of light on what might have gone wrong. Nobuo Uematsu spoke in a recent interview about how the company was effectively rudderless after Sakaguchi was forced out, stating that that was the reason he inevitably abandoned ship 2. Producer Yoshinori Kitase openly states that he's embarrassed by the original game, and the way it depicts social problems, social issues, and handles cultural depictions. And then you have director Naoki Hamaguchi, who seems to effectively view Remake as a replacement for the original, saying that he hopes people play it first, all the while admitting that he's filled Remake with member berries that only make any sense if you've already played the original. It's not really that hard to figure out how things went so sideways with Remake when Square Enix seemingly cared so little about it that they initially outsourced development to CyberConnect 2. And, even after bringing it in-house, Tetsuya Nomura, who famously had to be talked down from switching gears mid-development on Final Fantasy XV and trashing months of work because he suddenly wanted to make it a musical the morning after seeing Les Mis, that Tetsuya Nomura was the voice of reason telling them to cool it with the changes they wanted to make. I'm not sure how Revelation is going to attempt to tie things up, but I'm also not sure it really matters when the foundations of the entire story are this fundamentally flawed. Oh well, if nothing else, at least there's no way for them to screw up the original. Oh,